Uh, Thanks, Mary, for coming into our class and being prepared to share your thoughts and ideas around leadership and some of the more recent research and discussions you've been having around leadership. And we had a webinar recently with the class where we talked about how the whole, not only organizations, but the world itself has changed dramatically in terms of the issues that we're dealing with, and particularly the implications around the demands on leaders. So I suppose my question to you is, what is complexity? We use that word over and over again, and what implications does it have in terms of how we need to lead, both within our organizations and in the wider arena?
So, Vicky, as you know, we've been talking about these issues for quite a long time. I started the work in complexity in 2001, and you saw my early attempts to try to explain complexity to people where it was stumbling and bumbling along, really very conceptual. Well, what's happened now is complexity is here. I don't even have trouble getting into the topic of complexity because all people have to do is go watch the news and they see it all around them. We see it in the US with the election, the current election, and Donald Trump. That's an example of complexity. The most recent examples, other examples we can see are Brexit, that's complexity, the refugee crisis. All of these things that are happening are complexity. And what's happening is that because the world is so interconnected, and because we have technology and media that allows people to have a voice, what's underlying this recent complexity is a fundamental power shift. So you've seen, when I taught this before, I teach followership, I teach communication, I teach power. Now we see it all coming together because what's happening is the whole nature of leadership is changing. It's not that it's about leaders being in charge in structures and systems that have authority and it stays the same. Instead, it's about much more distributed voices and distributed leadership that's shifting power structures. So I'm going to explain complexity in a second, but when you and I talked last time, I was saying to you, I saw a tip to complexity in about 2010 where I would describe it as if it's complex, it's toppled. It's like this. The world, it was the global financial crisis and other things that were happening that were making leaders say, okay, it's no longer stable. It's not just about leading change. It's that we're in complexity and we don't know what to do about it. But I would say in the last year or so, it's like quicksand. It's like the foundations have crumbled. It's quicksand, and complexity is now pervasive, overwhelming. People have no idea how to respond to it, and they're making all the wrong responses.
Hmm. Yeah. So you see them, I often see them, what they do is they move into more ordered response, or, the more classic hierarchical. So they just try to do things, control more and more because it just seems so overwhelming.
That's exactly what happened. So I like to use the example of Trump and the Republican Party. You know, when Trump announced his candidacy a year ago now in June, nobody took him seriously. So the media, of course, loved him because they were getting all of this attention. The Republican Party wasn't even paying attention because they thought he was going to go away. But then in the fall, when they started to realize he was a force, they came in with what we call a classic ordered response. So the response was Mitt Romney doing his speech, criticizing Trump and saying how horrible he was. And then Jeb Bush came out and he just did a speech that was essentially Reaganomics from the 1980s. And he said, hey, we're the Republican Party. This is what our party is. And when both of them did that, the people who are voting for Trump said, or even the people who didn't vote said, see, this is how out of touch you are. You think that's what it is. We're trying to say it's not. You're not listening to us. And so it fueled the movement. So rather than stopping Trump, it actually fed right into it. So it's a perfect example to highlight some complexity terms, which we can go through in the slides.
Okay, yeah. So
Let's,
maybe
let's do
let's
that.
unpack complexity a bit more.
Okay, so if we talk about what is complexity, I don't know if you've used this slide already. You've seen me do this many times. This is the simplest way to do it. I try to refine it down, and what we get into is complexity. I can describe complexity in two words, and the two words are rich interconnectivity. So rich interconnectivity means that things are interconnected, but then when they interact with each other, they fundamentally change each other. So the example we like to talk about here is mayonnaise, which I say in a funny way. I know you all laugh at me, mayonnaise or something. And
Mayonnaise, we
um,
say, yes.
I know, but when I've used it with the Aussies before, they've laughed at. They're like, "What are you saying?" And then jumbo jet. So complexity is rich interconnectivity. It's not complicated. A jumbo jet is complicated, but mayonnaise is complex. And the reason is because when you add pieces to the jumbo jet, it doesn't change the other part. So you add a wheel, it doesn't change the wing. You add a piece of glass, it doesn't change the steel. So that's just complicated and it can be decomposed back. But mayonnaise, when you mix the eggs and the oil and the lemon, they they create a phase transition. They change the other part, and it's not decomposable back, so you can't take
Mm,
it back to the original ingredients. So what's happening in complexity is that when this happens, it's fundamentally shifted. There's a phase transition. And the Republican Party might think that they can go back, but they can't. There is no Republican Party like what it was before. Brexit means Brexit, right? That's what they're saying in the UK. There's
mm.
not going back. Once the decision is made, once this emergence event has occurred, then you're pretty much stuck with it and you have to figure out where to go from there. So this also helps us to see some other concepts, complexity is about emergence.
Yeah.
And I don't know, have you covered emergence much in your class?
Not at this stage, no. So the students would have had the opportunity to read about it, but I think it's really good to explore examples and just get a real sense of what emergence is, because it's interesting, as I work more and more in this space, I can see it happening around me all the time. And so that's the sort of position you want to be in, a leader. You can actually see it, you understand yourself, how you can be the tag, how an idea can be a tag, and so you can actually see it happening around you live. So it'd be really good to explore this and maybe unpack some examples.
And I think, you'll see here the example that I have is the Egyptian Revolution. That's one I was using for a long time. I don't even need to use that one anymore. We have about 50 examples we could use today. And
Yeah.
a year ago, I was saying, I need some good examples. I was talking with my colleagues, I need some examples. Now it's like, which one do I talk about? Because there are so many of them. But essentially, what happens in emergence is that you have these little dots. So think about the dot. We call it call that an agent. An agent is a person, a piece of information, an idea, a resource. So it can be anything. It doesn't have to be just a person. And so agents begin to come together and they link up. They begin to bond. So that's the dots and the lines, is the way I like to talk about this. Now, when agents bond, they become an aggregate. And then when they link up with more, they become a meta aggregate. And so this process continues of this bonding and this linking up. The simple way to think about it is linking up.
Yeah.
And then at some point in the linking up process, what happens is it's not just a meta aggregate, but it creates that phase transition. That's the emergence event. So look at Brexit. There were lots of people trying to make that happen. That was all the aggregation. The vote was the phase transition to where it's fundamentally different and you can't go back.
Mm.
Republican Party the same way. They're stuck with Trump now. Even if Trump doesn't get elected, there's no going back to what they were before. So
So,
that's emergence.
yeah. So my understanding, if you look at Trump and you look at, I can't remember his name, but the guy who pushed the whole Brexit, they actually were the stimulators. They were the catalyst. And I think in complexity language, or in, I would say maybe the tags, the things that cause people to start, moving forward. So, I mean, you and I have had a discussion. I mean, the interesting thing is that if you look at Trump and you maybe look at other leaders, they think it's all about them, but actually, they are the ones. It's like a bit like Mandela. We've talked about Mandela before. Um, they essentially just got the movement going. Would that be
Well,
right?
that's what's so interesting about it is that the traditional leadership story would say Trump is charismatic and he's had this vision and he created this. And usually when I'm teaching this, a lot of students have trouble separating that. So if we use the example, Mandela or Martin Luther King, they have trouble separating the charismatic leader from the movement. They really think it's about the person. In this case with Trump, it's pretty darn easy to see it's not about him, although he thinks it is. It's
Mm.
really about the fact that there are all these people out there with a sentiment, with a feeling, what we call in our early work a need. And what he's doing is tapping into that need. So in this picture of Martin Luther King, you see all of those heads out there. If you think about those as dots, that Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech, where people came, but they came for civil rights. They didn't come to listen to him. Instead, what happened was when he spoke, all those lines started linking up. So those dots started connecting and they bonded. And if you could imagine an animation of all these dots with lines connecting between, that's what complexity is. That's the aggregation process that creates the phase transition. And the leaders are the tag. They're the tag or the attractor. So if you look, you can see lots and lots of tags now. This is why messaging and communication becomes so important. But it's really about figuring out where the need is and what that dynamic is, and then tapping into it and linking it up. Or conversely, if you don't want it to happen, stopping the linking up. That's what the ordered response does wrong. It doesn't stop the linking up.
Yeah, yeah. So if you think about leaders and organizations, this has implications for them about how they lead innovation and change, because our immediate response is to set up a vision, set up a set of steps, and then off we go. And over again, leaders say to me, it never works. So the thing is that if they, these are leaders, both in the classroom and all the leaders we teach are trying to allow their organizations to adapt to the pressures external and internal to the organization, but primarily external. So what implications does this have as a leader? What does it mean that they're going to step out and do to try and get this process starting to happen? Because that's the positive side of it. We've looked at some of the negative, but how do they give voice to people and allow emergence to happen?
And that's the challenge, is how do you actually drive change in an organization? And the one thing that we know is that it doesn't work very well to drive it top down.
Yeah.
So the idea that leaders can come in and have a vision and get others to follow them, many people would say, I don't know if it ever worked, but it's certainly much more difficult to get it to happen today. So instead, what you need to do is plant seeds of emergence. You have to find those agents, those dots out there in the organization, and you link them up. You connect them. You help create tags and attractors for those things to come together and to drive change in a way that would be beneficial for you. The other thing is information flows. So complexity is enabled by information flows and by resources. And so you want to resource the change in a way that you help individuals. Now, the key thing about resources is you don't want to over-resource. We think, well, put money on it. But quite often, when we're talking about the kind of change that we need, too much money can create a problem. So you actually want to create tension. And tension's at the core of the model of how we drive change in organizations.
So that's interesting, the whole idea of tension, because we immediately, if you look at leadership models, it's all about harmony. It's about, galvanizing people behind a vision. So this whole concept of tension is it's quite a very different way of looking at leadership, and I think quite challenging for people, because they say to me, oh, I don't know how to deal with all this tension. So what do we mean by all this tension? What is it? How does a leader create it? What does it mean in terms of their leadership?
Well, the interesting thing, and you mentioned it, is the positive norms that we put around leadership, and I call that the feel-good model. One of the things we know is that the feel-good model, it doesn't really work. It's more in the tension and more in understanding how you can enable creativity and innovation and adaptability. So what we know is that these old models aren't working. The foundations of modern management are over 100 years old. They're focused on physical assets and efficiency and control. So what you really need to do is think about how to enable intellectual or social assets and knowledge, adaptability, and learning. And just think about that. Most of what we do in organizations stifles knowledge, adaptability, and learning. If people come with ideas, they have suggestions, they want to try and get things done, they're quite often shut down. And we talk about that as when complexity occurs in an organization, instead of going to a complex response, we go to an ordered response, which you mentioned earlier. So it takes complexity to beat complexity. But despite this, and I'm sorry the slides are a little bit messed up in the conversion from the Mac, but despite this, leaders respond with order. So when complexity occurs, it occurs in the form of pressures on the system. That stresses people out. And people want comfort. They want to go back to feeling good. And they say to the leader, take this away, make me feel better. Or the leaders say, well, I'm in charge because that's what makes a good leader. That's what I've been taught to do. And so they drive to an ordered response. And it looks like this.
Yeah.
Complexity comes in the form of pressures. There's a desire for control, which tightens the administrative function and traditional leadership. And then that goes to bureaucratization, which stifles adaptive dynamics. So, really, what we need to do is think about the tension dynamic. And I think you've seen me do this one before, too. So, I'm just going to run through this one, Vicky, real quickly. But this is at the core of the complexity leadership model. Essentially, we found is, and this isn't surprising, but all organizations have two systems. One is the entrepreneurial system, and the other is the administrative or the operational system. All organizations start out entrepreneurial, but then they bring on administration. And as soon as they do, these two things go into battle. So when they go into battle, the administrators are trying to stifle out the entrepreneurs, and the one that typically wins in that tension is the entrepreneurial system, which is the ordered response. So when administrative or operational comes in and wipes out that tension, what it's doing is it's wiping out the entrepreneurial system, and that's the very system that you need for adaptability.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what we need instead is to think about adaptability being in tension. And this is where you get into the adaptive space. And this was the big discovery we had in the last couple of years, is that at the core of dealing with complexity and being innovative, enabling adaptive systems, is this idea of creating adaptive space for tension to generate emergence. So it looks like this, that when there's tension between the different systems or different individuals, different agents, then they have to work through the tension, and out of that comes a new idea or a new innovation. Emergence occurs when that gets into the system. And so it's really a networked model in terms of it occurs in the local and then it gets into the formal system. And you can pull this model up and talk with your class more about it and explain it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll
But
do that. Yeah.
essentially, it looks like the overall picture, I'm trying to get to it, is this one. This is what an organization looks like as a complex adaptive
Yeah.
system.
And so it raises questions because some of the questions I've had in some of the workshops I've run is that when people think about leadership, they think themselves either in the operational space or sometimes in the entrepreneurial space. What they don't see themselves is in that adaptive space. And and so we've had some interesting discussions where when we've gone through this model, they've suddenly realized actually for them leadership is primarily, depending on the needs of the organization, could be primarily in that adaptive space and creating that emergence to happen. So I don't know whether you've had the same discussions in your classrooms and in your your workshops.
Well, so actually, an activity I encourage you to do and a conversation you could have as a follow-up to this discussion is where people see themselves. Do they
Yes.
see themselves more as, and I'm going to go back, go back a slide to the behaviors view and show you this. So you have the entrepreneurial leadership, and in the entrepreneurial leadership space, what's happening is that people have ideas, they're really innovative, really creative, they're good at taking that idea and saying, hey, what if we do this? Let's try and get this done. They run it by other people. And so they come up with ideas, with things that would lead to learning, to growth for the organization. And then you have the administrative or the operational. Those are people who are really good at getting things into the system. They know how to run the formal administrative system. It might be saying that they're more bureaucratic, but they're just comfortable in that idea of, and we need this because this is what managers do. They're really effective at working things through and executing. But then there are other people who are enabling and they're able to operate in the middle. And these people are individuals who are good at facilitating, who drop seeds of emergence, who create conditions for people to come together and be innovative. They're comfortable with emergence. So I tend to be one of these. I think you are too, where I love to create a space, bring people in, put in just the right amount of tension, and then let them run. Let them get a little bit uncomfortable. Actually, I like to let them get a lot uncomfortable. Oops, sorry, my light went off. Okay, I like to let them get a lot uncomfortable, but they might not. But then you kind of manage that to see what emerges in that. And it's
Yeah.
in the interaction between people and the interaction that creates the emergence where it's a lot of fun. So I would say have a conversation with people in your class. What are you? Are you entrepreneurial? Are you enabling? Are you operational? And you can be all of them.
Yes, you can. Yeah. But the interesting thing is when we were talking the other day, you were talking about how those people who are comfortable in the adaptive space can actually shift into operational and entrepreneurial. They have that flexibility. So if you think about that adaptive space, what are people doing there? That's what are leaders actually doing in that adaptive space? Because I know you started working with Michael and a few people in organizations, and I think that's helpful for people to understand, because if they don't have an intuitive sense of adaptive space, maybe helping them with some sort of toolkit or ideas might get them into that space.
Right. So Michael is the Chief Talent Officer at General Motors. He's my co-author on this work, and he started taking this model and trying to essentially create a living lab at GM and implement the principles. And so this is what he came up with in terms of explaining how to do this in an organization. That adaptive space is a combination of pressures. The pressures are the igniter. They get it, they create the condition where something has to change. That's complexity in the environment. And then there are practices and there are principles. Practices are help you to get this done, but principles is the understanding that allows you to get to mastery. Yeah. So I'm not going to go through all of this, Vicky. You can talk with your class about this if you want to. You've got the slides, but the pressures. But here are some examples of adaptive practices. What Michael has done is create situations or contexts at General Motors where people can come together, and it actually creates the adaptive space. So things like collabs, where it's a combination of hackathon, design thinking, engagement workshop. And so they're having one, in fact, this week where one of my co-authors is going to go and observe again. But they have a problem they're solving. They bring them together. They engage them, and they do a lot of facilitation, a lot of OD kind of stuff, org design, or org development stuff to get them really engaging effectively. They go very, very creative. And then they give them tools and possibilities for going back to their work environment and continuing to get things done. What Michael has actually done is put together a toolkit where people can come in, they grab the toolbox, they say, we don't need you, we just want the toolbox, and then they go out and they do their own adaptive space. So he's now trained them to where they can function without him, which is really the sign of success. Yeah. And then he's got these great principles too. So these are clear complexity concepts, but ones that he's put practitioner terms around. So start small. You know, it's to think about creating emergence on a small level. You don't want to go too big. I could tell you stories on this, but I think you can come up with some of your own. Find a friend, that's the linking up. If you have somebody else, that's the start of the linking up process.
Yeah.
Follow the energy. The energy is the need. And that's where people really, really get the motivation and the momentum. So that's the energy behind all of this. And then set boundaries, because you can't go crazy with it. And we know that from creativity. Embrace the conflict. That's essentially saying to people, you need to be comfortable in the tension. And then create network closure is that concept we've talked about, Vicky, around sponsorship, that essentially you can't get it into the system unless you know people in the system. So find a sponsor, find ways to get this into the formal system.
And this has a lot of implications about the actual competencies you have as a leader, because exactly what you talked about, this is essentially about facilitation, and it's about, because you can't do the command style, because here what you're doing is creating a space and allowing people to explore in that space. So you're allowing the self-determination to develop, but also creating those boundaries, which I think is so people can work within, as you say, within a boundary. And I suppose, so where does things like giving a sense of direction, how do you allow people to actually move forward with innovation? Because they also talk about network closure. So what have you observed that they do?
Well, I'm laughing because as soon as you say give people direction, this would say, no, don't. Don't give direction. Try to stay out of it. I mean, you're essentially, it's not about giving direction and solving it for them. It's rather about helping identify a pressure that they need to respond to, and then enabling them to respond. And if there's anything we found in our research, it's that one of the biggest problems is managers step in too much.
Yes.
I can tell you a quick story about Michael on this one. So Michael has had tremendous success at General Motors. He's been there for about 3 years, I think. I lose track of years, but um, he almost got fired a couple of times. So at one point, he almost got fired, and he had to pull out. And when he pulled out, he wasn't allowed to be involved in this anymore. And I told him that's why this thing took off.
Yes.
It took off because what happened was he had trained them just enough. He gave them the principles so they knew what they were doing. He energized them. Him having to pull out made them own it, and they bubbled it up. It went crazy bubbling up from within when he was gone because they wanted it so much.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a really different kind of way of thinking about leadership.
It is. It is. So just bringing it to a close, what are some of the things that you would leave what are the ideas that you think leaders should take away and really give some thought to?
So many, but I would say first, recognize complexity for what it is.
Yeah.
Watch for it. Look for complexity happening around you. That's first step. And you said that earlier. You said you see complexity all around you now. Recognize it, because if you can recognize it, then you understand that you shouldn't go to the ordered response. There's a different way that you have to react and interact when complexity is occurring. So that's first step. Second step is then when it's occurring, think about how you can enable the adaptive space. Think about how you can create the conditions of the adaptive dynamics for emergence to occur, and
Yeah.
not things that are going to either drive the movement against what you want. You have to play in that. You have to play in that interactive dynamic. And then third, I think there's an element of self-awareness around this. Some people listening are going to say, yep, I totally get this. This is what I do. They're going to be really charged. So when this is over, they're going to be bouncing, going, yay, this is so much fun. But other people are going to be sitting there going, I can't stand this. This makes me feel really bad inside. I
Mm.
don't like it. It's uncomfortable to me. I don't know what to do with it. And I think that that's important to recognize about yourself. Um, I think that we need to have more people who can deal with complexity. We still need people who do the traditional,
Mm.
but I think it's about helping people who feel that they can make some strides in this area, get the tools and the resources they need. Not dismissing people who don't do this, but we need, because of complexity, we're going to need more different kinds of leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks, Mary. It's been great to talk to you and to share your ideas. And I would look forward to reporting back to you how our class session goes. So thanks very much for your time.
Sounds great. Thanks, Vicky.